This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and YouTube. If you'd like to support me, you can find the links below. Jordan Peterson, let's talk about him, shall we? I used to be a fan of the guy and now I absolutely detest him. How did I go from point A to point B? What changed in my thought process? And if there are some of you that hold him in high regard, which my comments tell me there are quite a few of you, maybe this video might change your minds. Or maybe I'm wrong somewhere and you can point out the flaw in my logic. Oh, and one more thing. In one of my recent videos, I said this. I think Jordan Peterson is the Sadhguru of the West, or Sadhguru is the Jordan Peterson of the East, depending on how you look at it. I should probably clarify what I meant with that statement, because a lot of you have a disagreement here. So I definitely will. My name's Pranav. You're watching Science is Dope. Let's begin. I must begin by saying that nowhere in this video will I try to mock Jordan Peterson. I watched a bunch of videos while researching for this one, and a lot of the content that is critical of him has this element of mockery in them. Maybe they wanted to add some entertainment value to the video, but the only people it entertains are the ones who agree with the content of the video. It's like preaching to the choir. I've been making an active effort lately to reach people that disagree with me, and I hope this video will do just that. Also, this video is going to be a long one because it's a deep dive. I've made it easier for you to watch by inserting timestamps in the scroll bar. Check them out. A lot of my Indian audience may not be super familiar with him, so I should probably start with who he is and how he rose to fame. Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychology professor who rose to popularity through this video that came out in 2016.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
In the video, Peterson can be seen arguing with trans activists during protests. Peterson was against the legally mandated use of gender pronouns, something which according to him would become legal and mandatory once Canada enforced its C-16 bill. Peterson's main argument was that the bill infringed upon his freedom of speech, and allowing the government to decide which words are legal and which ones are not was a stepping stone to a dystopian world where all of what you say and express can be moderated by the government. We'll circle back to Bill C-16 and his views on it later on in the video, but right now let's get back to why he's popular. His arguments and his eloquence while using them resonated with a lot of people, particularly young men, and he developed a massive fan following in the years that followed. A lot of media appearances, a lot of talks and debates, and 2 best-selling books later, here we are today. To a lot of people who stand against all movements and ideas from the left, from trans rights to climate change, from atheism to feminism, Peterson became something of a role model, with them parroting his words and talking points. And there was a time when I got swayed by some of these points. Flashback to me during 2016, I was just as addicted to YouTube as I am now. The only difference was that I wasn't a creator back then, but I was an endless consumer. Now, I was already an atheist at this point, thanks to the likes of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. I hadn't deeply thought about things like feminism, LGBT rights, gay marriage, etc. because I'm a straight man, fairly privileged. These things didn't really affect me, and so there was no motivation in me to learn more about these things. I was still definitely a feminist. I was for LGBT rights. I was for gay marriage because these things are no-brainers, right? I mean, which sane person wouldn't want equal rights for all groups and individuals, especially if giving them rights wouldn't take anything away from you. Although very superficial, these were my positions back then. And apart from atheism, there was no real thought behind any of these. This was around the time when I discovered Jordan Peterson. Some of the things he said really spoke to me.
I don't think that young men hear words of encouragement. Some of them never in their entire lives, as far as I can tell. That's what they tell me. And the fact that the words that I've been speaking, the YouTube lectures that I've done and put online, for example, have had such a dramatic impact is an indication that young men are starving for this sort of message, because why in the world would they have to derive it from a lecture on YouTube?
He gave some really strong arguments against LGBT rights and sometimes even feminism. Here's him talking about the gender pay gap.
The gender pay gap stands at just over 9%. So it seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
It does seem that way, but multivariate analysis of the pay gap indicate that it doesn't exist. But there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is gender, but it's not the only reason. Women in aggregate are paid less than men. Okay, well, then we break it down by age, we break it down by occupation, we break it down by interest, we break it down by personality.
Now, I'm an impressionable young man at the time watching Peterson steamroll over gender pay gap arguments, thinking these feminists are either lying or they're stupid. The gender pay gap doesn't exist. Obviously, I'm taking Peterson at his word. Why would an academic like Peterson lie to me or misinform me? Another thing that's happening at the same time is YouTube is filled with these right-wing creators. I'm talking about American creators because creators from India hadn't really gotten on the platform yet. I'm watching them put out videos of Ben Shapiro, who's another right-wing spokesperson. Ben Shapiro destroying SJWs. I also see feminist outbursts from these red-haired, clearly man-hating feminists talking about how masculinity is toxic and ruins lives on the one side, and on the other side I see people like Peterson saying toxic masculinity isn't a thing and these feminists are clearly in the wrong.
What precisely is toxic masculinity, as opposed to, say, toxic femininity? So if it's a matter of transgressing against the boundaries of gender-appropriate behavior, it's just as likely to happen among women as among men, in which case it's not toxic masculinity.
A combination of all this created a very negative image of feminism in my head. Now, I acknowledge that it was my fault for not looking deeper into this and forming my opinions based on superficial takes from these folks. But hey, here was an impressionable young man who got swayed by the content he was exposed to. But now that I'm a little older and I've had the time to reflect on what I was thinking, I realized my characterization of feminism lies on arguments like these made by Peterson, right-wing creators like Ben Shapiro dunking on college kids, and right-leaning creators making content attacking feminism. Let's take them one by one. First, Peterson denying the gender pay gap. Unfortunately, he doesn't cite where he's getting his research from, but a little bit of digging and here's what I found. A paper published in the Journal of Economic Literature that looks at data on the gender pay gap over 3 decades, and it does exactly what Peterson wants. Controls for multiple variables that could explain the wage gap, and you know what it found? There is still a 9% pay gap between men and women even with all those controls. Cathy Newman was right. Jordan Peterson, for all his confidence while making this assertion, turns out to be wrong. By the way, this video went pretty viral for the way Cathy Newman tried to strawman Peterson throughout. The phrase, "so you're saying that," has become a meme at this point. Now, despite how poorly this interview was conducted, Newman, it turns out, had some good points. Second, I also understand how these man-hating feminists are probably not the best examples of feminism. To paint the whole of feminism as just these people from the extremes is a basic black and white fallacy. And third, anyone who uses Ben Shapiro as an argument, a man who only dunks on college kids and can't face a journalist in an argument, instantly loses my respect. I saw how feminism had been misrepresented to me by the people who stood against it. As for Jordan Peterson, his various lines of arguments on different issues, not just feminism, began breaking down one by one in front of me. If you want, you can find tons of videos critiquing him by various creators. Mine will be just one among them. There's more to come on Jordan Peterson attacking trans rights, on Bill C-16, on how all this relates to India. All that is gonna come later in the video. But I wanted to talk now about what prompted me to look deeper into Jordan Peterson. The things he says so confidently, with so much conviction, may not hold ground once you look deeper into it. Now, I'd been an atheist since before I discovered Peterson. I had a pretty solid understanding of my position and I could hold my ground pretty well in an argument on atheism. And so it really surprised me when I learned that Peterson was a practicing Christian. All his other talking points seemingly made sense to me, but his God belief didn't. And so I was really interested in what he had to say on the topic. And I would diligently watch his conversations with prominent atheists like like Sam Harris, Matt Dillahunty, etc. to try and understand his views. See, my position is this. If you want to claim that there exists a God who can influence things in your life or anywhere in the world or anywhere in the universe for that matter, then that is a claim about reality. And any claim about reality is meaningless without evidence, because evidence is an indicator of truth and there is no evidence for God. Now, when you ask Peterson, do you believe in God? This is what you'll probably hear.
What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God?
Because Peterson defines God in a very sophisticated way, which is very different from the way the average person defines it.
You have a hierarchy of values. You have to. Otherwise, you can't act or you're painfully confused. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you.
But the average person will only see how a well-spoken intellectual like Peterson believes in God and finds validation for his or her own belief.
Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter because it's God for you.
This definition of God is so vague and all-encompassing that he gets away with calling well-renowned public atheists as Christians.
This is the argument I've had with people like Sam Harris, the atheist types. It's like, yeah, you think you're atheist, man. It's like you're Christian, Judeo-Christian, let's say, to the core.
I actually don't believe in a God, and I could write
But you act
poetry.
like you do.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't
I
want to
act
throw poor
like-
Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay, so I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God, and
Yeah.
your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense. But my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God.
By the way, that conversation between Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty is an absolute treat to watch. I'll leave a link to it down below. There were instances in that conversation where I felt like Peterson was deliberately trying to confuse Dillahunty because he couldn't respond to Matt's coherent points.
If you chop off my head, it's in contradiction to my well-being. I mean, but the point
No,
of-
I wasn't willing to grant that, actually.
Okay.
I'm saying that's a metaphysical presupposition. You're just saying I have to accept that. It's
No,
like-
I'm not telling you
because
at all what to accept.
Sure you are. You're saying
I'm
that
trying
your death
to,
would be
I'm
wrong.
trying to explain what my position is.
Okay, but you said that that wouldn't be in accordance with your well-being. Okay, that's a metaphysical statement or philosophical statement. It's not an obvious fact.
That
That's not
chopping
a
off somebody's
fact.
head is contrary to their well-being.
It depends on how you define well-being.
Sure.
Yeah, but it matters.
But if you define well-being as this glass of water, we're no longer talking about the same thing.
Well, you can define well-being. That's fine. That's what I'm waiting for.
This is what I'm. Well,
You can't do it. You can't define well-being. It's
well, then
very,
why
very
should I try? I
difficult.
certainly can't do it if you keep telling me I can't do it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll back off. There's a...
But none of that happened. Dillahunty cut through all that confusing stuff and laid bare what Peterson really was. A typical conservative apologist that had an outdated understanding of what an atheist was. This is something that happened during the Q&A section of that talk.
What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He murders this horrible woman, who's horrible according to everyone who knows her. Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational, pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it. So he does. But what he finds out is that he broke an inviolable moral rule.
Atheists are murderers. What a sad and unsophisticated understanding of what an atheist is. Something that you usually hear from a blind believer who has never met anyone outside his circle. Of course, he said it in a more sophisticated manner with the Peterson charm and all that needless complication. But Matt came back with a beautiful reply. I'll let him speak for himself.
And this is what atheists hear all the time when they come out. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. And then atheists come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years. And they're like, you're an atheist? How can that be? You're such a good person. I've known you all this time. It's because the mindset of what people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture, right up to the height of intellectual pursuits. And it's time for that to end.
That deserves an applause. Anyway, this video came out in 2018 and I remember watching it. It was like a turning point for me and I kind of lost respect for Peterson. I mean, till that point, he was someone that had these hard-hitting and high-level arguments, even on the theism front, and I've never seen anyone being able to counter them well. And I just thought I was too stupid to understand what Peterson was saying. Now I know what he's saying is just purposefully confusing. Like, he's so precise on literally any other topic, but when it comes to religion, he has to complicate things, confuse his opponent, muddy the water in order to get away with justifying his belief. Because if he states his belief in a straightforward way like he should, then it just becomes very hard to defend. If he does though, then he just ends up saying stuff like this.
There's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it.
Anyway, it sounds to me like Jordan Peterson is a conservative Christian who doesn't want to admit he doesn't believe in God in a conventional sense. Instead, he says he believes in God, but he has to say what he means by believe in God as A, B, C, all these things. But all his arguments were reduced to nothing in front of Matt Dillahunty. Probably why Peterson has never had another conversation with him since then. Anyway, like I said, you should watch the talk. I'll link it in the description. Now, it was after this same talk that I decided never to take him at his word when he cites the results of studies. And that was because of this moment from that talk.
This is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without supernatural?
There aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation. You can use a drug called bupropion. I think that's the one. It's whatever Wellbutrin is.
Is that supernatural?
No, you don't need a supernatural effect, but it doesn't work very well. But if you give people magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and they have a mystical experience, they have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation with one treatment. But that's kind of like evidence, you know.
Okay, so according to Peterson, you have evidence of the supernatural from the fact that psilocybin, a chemical found in psychedelic mushrooms when given to people who are trying to quit smoking, if it induces a mystical experience, can get them to actually quit smoking. Now, assuming that the study was perfectly designed and the results were conclusive, this is clearly not evidence of the supernatural. This is just evidence that psilocybin use helps people quit smoking. Their subjective description of their experience as mystical can't, by any standard, be objective evidence that something mystical is actually happening. But let's also look at the study just in case. It's basically a pilot study involving 15 participants who got a 15-week smoking cessation treatment. That's weekly meetings along with psilocybin treatment. And although they did have an 80% success rate at 6 months, the researchers themselves state that the results of the present study are limited by the relatively small and homogeneous sample. Therefore, these findings must be considered preliminary. Compare this with what Peterson said.
They have about an 85% chance of smoking cessation with
Sure,
one treatment.
But
But that's kind of like evidence, you know.
If this isn't misrepresentation of science, then I don't know what is. Now, to be fair to him, it could be that Peterson misread the study or misremembered its findings. And just because he's clearly wrong here doesn't mean he's wrong everywhere else. But one thing was for sure, from that point, I was not gonna take what he said at his word. Jordan Peterson's initial rise to fame was when he claimed that Canada's legislation through Bill C-16 was legally mandating compelled speech, namely gender pronouns. And this was going against his freedom of speech. Let's examine 2 points here. One, about Bill C-16 and 2 about freedom of speech. First, what did Bill C-16 actually say? I'll leave a link to the actual bill down below so you can read it yourself. It's just an amendment to Canada's Human Rights Act, which adds trans people to the list of protected groups. It basically protects people from discrimination in housing, employment, etc. on the basis of age, race, religion, disabilities, and now gender identity and expression. That's it. No compelled speech whatsoever. It basically has none of what Peterson says it has. His entire initial rise to fame was based on a straw man. Let's also talk about free speech. What is the purpose of free speech? It's not the freedom to say whatever you like. It's not the freedom to be an ass. Why do you need to be legally protected if you want to be a dick? Does that even make sense? Take this example. Imagine that you were swinging your arms. That's perfectly fine, right? You have the right to move how you like. Now imagine that someone was in the way and gets knocked back. By exercising your right to swing your arms however you like, you're violating another person's right not to be assaulted. Basically, your right to swing your fists ends where another person's nose begins. Apply the same idea to speech and expression, but not in a simplistic way of one person just saying something the other person doesn't like. That would be a very childish interpretation. But imagine someone's speech and expression and practices ends up being discriminatory, like denying the other person housing or employment or even medical care. That shouldn't happen. That becomes a violation of their human rights. That is oppression. And this oppression of the trans community was what Bill C-16 was trying to prevent. Freedom of speech is necessary for a free society, and its purpose is so that the powerless can be equals with the powerful. This is just my opinion, but once you see Jordan Peterson as a typical conservative Christian, a lot of his ideological positions start to make a lot more sense. Like, he isn't against the LGBT community because this bill comes in the way of his freedom of speech. That's just how he likes to dress up his argument, maybe just to confuse people. Because if he says it in a straightforward way that God doesn't like them, how will it look on him? I mean, he's an academic after all. Now, I have strong reasons for holding these opinions. Here's him speaking on gay marriage.
I'm curious to hear your views on gay marriage. Well, I would be against it too if it was backed by cultural Marxists, because it isn't clear to me that it will satisfy the ever-increasing, what would you call it, demand for an assault on traditional modes of being. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me, because if the marital vows are taken seriously, then it seems to me that it's a means whereby gay people can be integrated more thoroughly into standard society.
Does Jordan live in the year 1870 or something? Does he not understand the concept of gay people being in love and wanting to marry each other? I wouldn't be surprised at this coming from a conservative Christian, but from Jordan Peterson, it's even worse when I see his opinions on climate change.
Hard to sort out. The climate change one is a weird one. So
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay. But your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on warming. A set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
It seems to me like Jordan's conservative values, especially Christian values, are more important to him than what actual scientists say. Also, this pattern is not isolated to the West. It's something I've seen developing in India for a few years now. Before 2016-17, I mainly watched YouTube creators from the West, but it was dominated by these right-wing creators. If it wasn't a video featuring Jordan Peterson directly, it would be someone parroting his talking points like how the wage gap doesn't exist or how climate change isn't an issue, but it's a little more balanced now with almost all his misinformation having been debunked. A lot of left-leaning creators have come into the space now. So the average person who comes in with no pre-existing opinions won't be flooded with all this misinformation from the Jordan Peterson types. That's not the case with India though. YouTube India is still heavily dominated by these right-wing creators. Many of them with 1 million plus audiences and most of them putting out misinformation, misrepresenting science, and all their audiences just blindly believing the stuff they say. I'm not saying that misinformation comes only from the right. Both sides have misinformation. But when a young person forms opinions based on content they are bombarded with, which is only from one side, that becomes a problem. And when something is clearly wrong, I don't see enough voices calling it out. But I see one thing in common. If it was Jordan Peterson who led the charge for all this misinformation content in the West, it's Sadhguru here in India. A lot of creators who follow in their footsteps usually get most of their talking points from these two. Jordan Peterson fans are basically like a cult of young men, misinformed and mostly right-leaning, and so are the Sadhguru fanboys. The main reason for this is that the things they say usually targets minority groups and women, and so it usually finds an audience with people that are not in those groups, like straight young men. Now, this isn't to say that they only have audiences in these demographics, but they certainly are the majority. I see a lot of young, impressionable people coming onto the platform and forming their opinions based on all this misinformation content, not realizing how damaging actions based on it can be to certain communities. A feature of many people who support ideologies like these, and I'll put religions also in there, especially Hinduism, is that these people usually come from the upper rungs of these hierarchies. They're privileged by these hierarchies that oppress many others. They would never support the ideology if it oppressed them. Just ask yourself, would you want to be born into a society with this kind of hierarchy if you weren't allowed to choose which part of the hierarchy you'd be born into? When I made that video and made a comparison between Jordan Peterson and Sadhguru, I think many people got the impression I'm saying they're exactly alike. Of course not. Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, a university professor, and Sadhguru is what? Maybe I shouldn't have gone there. But their confidence when spouting misinformation and the huge cult-like following they have and the other commonalities I've listed so far should tell you why I made that comparison. I'm not saying that Peterson brings nothing of value. He does, for instance.
The best way to teach people critical thinking is to teach them to write, because there's no difference between that and thinking. You need to learn to think, because thinking makes you act effectively in the world. Thinking makes you win the battles you undertake, and those could be battles for good things.
This is advice I still use every day. Whenever my thoughts feel cluttered, I write them down. That helps me see various holes in my thought process. I try and address them, and the next time I have more clarity about things. In fact, that's why I like making these YouTube videos, because writing scripts helps me bring so much clarity to whatever I want to say. Now, this is the basic idea of journaling, and it wasn't invented by Jordan Peterson or something, but I have to give him credit because I do it because of him. There are many similar things of value that he says. But the question we must ask ourselves is, be the rhetoric of Jordan Peterson or someone like Sadhguru, is the value they bring to the table worth all the harm they cause? Content like this is something sponsors don't really want to associate with. Some of my most popular videos involve debunking myths and superstitions and pseudoscience from religion. That also makes my videos prone to demonetization. But at the same time, many of you find value in this kind of content, and it's your support that keeps me going. If you'd like to support me even a little bit, you can find links below. Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, UPI, YouTube memberships. thanks button, website and merch. There are many options at your disposal. I've not had a single sponsored video since January. Let's see how long we can keep that going. If you like this video, you might also like this one I did recently on Sadhguru analyzing his study. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, remember, science is dope.